Hi, hello, vanakkam, and welcome back to yet another episode on your favorite Little's Law YouTube channel. So, in the last few videos, in terms of your platform or your Azure DevOps engineers, so we were seeing about the service endpoint and the private endpoint, but both of them look almost similar, right? So, today in this video, we will see what are all the differences between the service endpoint and the private endpoint so that you can better explain on why should we use or where should we use the service endpoint or where should we use the private endpoints because they both look almost similar, but there are several scenarios where you must use the service endpoint or where you have to use the private endpoints, right? So firstly, let's see what is a service endpoint. So the service endpoint will extend your virtual network, which is your VNet's private address space to Azure services over the Azure backbone network. So just underline this word, which is the backbone network, because the service endpoint will extend your virtual network's private address space to Azure services, right? And that happens over the Azure backbone network. And when it comes to the private endpoint, so the definition of private endpoint is the private endpoint brings the service into your virtual network by assigning a private IP address from your VNet to the service. So that's the difference. So the previous one, which is the service endpoint, will extend your VNet's private address space to Azure services over the Azure backbone network. But the private endpoint brings the service into your virtual network by assigning a private IP address from your virtual network to the service. So that's the basic difference. And the second point, which is in terms of the network. So the traffic to the service remains within the Azure's backbone network, but the service itself is still accessed via the public endpoint. And when it comes to the private endpoint, so the traffic to the services uses the private IP within your VNet, and they are fully isolated from the public internet because, as the name clearly mentioned, it is a private endpoint. So they are completely isolated from the public internet. But in terms of the service endpoint, the service, the traffic to the service remains within the Azure backbone network, but still the service itself is still accessed via the public endpoint. And then moving to the configuration for the service endpoint, so it's easier to configure, and you can simply enable the service endpoint on a subnet. So it's so simple, you can just easily configure it by enabling the service endpoint on the subnet. And then when it comes to the private endpoint, the configuration is quite complex, and you have to create a private endpoint resource, and you have to manage it via the DNS, which is the domain name solution, the domain name resolution thing. So that's the reason I'm telling you that private endpoint is quite complex because they deal with the security. So that's going to be the next point. So when it comes to the security, the service endpoint enhances the security by allowing you to restrict access to specific subnets. So that's the only option to increase the security. So that is by restricting the access to the specific subnets. But when it comes to the private endpoint, it has the highest level of security as the service is completely isolated within your VNet and accessed via the private IP. And that's the reason we use private endpoint when in terms of some services, you want to have them in highly secured manner. And when it comes to the visibility, the resources in your VNet can access the service directly, but the service still has a public endpoint. So let me reiterate it. So the resources in your VNet can access the service directly, but the service still has a public endpoint. But when it comes to the private endpoint, the service is accessed via a private IP, and it makes it completely private and isolated. So every time it's when it comes to private endpoint, it's completely into private and it keeps private and isolated, and that's the reason you can build the highest level of security for the services. And finally, when it comes to the cost, so there are no additional cost for the service endpoint itself, but standard network charges do apply. And when it comes to the private endpoint, additional cost for the private endpoint and standard network charges apply. So in terms of cost, yes, you have to pay more for the private endpoints. And then what are the ideal reasons for using these service endpoints? Okay, so far we saw about the differences about the service endpoints and then the private endpoints. We saw about the network, on which network do they travel, and what is how do you do the configuration, and what is the security level, and what are their visibility. That's fine, but what are the ideal reasons to use service endpoints? Okay, so when you need a simple way to improve security and performance for accessing the Azure services from a VNet, you can use the service endpoints. Or when you want to maintain the public endpoint access for a service, yes, you can use a service endpoint. Or when you want to do minimal configuration changes, you can use the service endpoint. And what are all the ideal reasons for using private endpoints? So when you need to completely isolate the access to the service within your VNet, you have to use the private endpoint, which is again, let me reiterate it. So when you want to completely isolate the access to the services within your VNet, yes, you have to use a private endpoint. And when you want to regularly, or you have any compliance requirements mandated for no exposure to the public internet, yes, you have to use the private endpoints. And finally, when you need any granular control over native network security and access, yes, you have to use private endpoints. So again, the private endpoints is something which is completely avoiding the exposure to public internet, or they isolate the access to the services, or when you need any granular control over the network security and access. So now let me tell you, let me just quickly take you through the ideal scenarios. So where all the scenarios we can use the service endpoints. When we want to improve the security and performance for accessing the Azure services, we still need the service endpoint. And finally, when you want to have your application, your services in the highest level of security, which ensures there is a complete, which is completely isolated within your VNet, yes, you have to use the private endpoint. So overall, both service endpoints and private endpoints offer ways to enhance the security and performance of accessing the Azure services, but they cater to different needs and scenarios, and the service endpoints are simpler to configure and provide a good balance of security and accessibility, while the private endpoints offer complete isolation and higher security at the cost of added complexity and expense. So make sure you have to choose one that best fits your specific requirements and constraints, because most of the time when we want to create any subscriptions, we have to be very clear in what endpoints are we going to use. So with that, I come to an end, and I believe this video would be very useful to you. So in case if you want to gain a lot of knowledge into Azure DevOps, or into uh, platform engineering, or you want to change your career as a platform engineer into Azure, yeah, you can subscribe to our channel and watch more videos on the Azure, the cloud, and the PaaS, which is the platform as a service. And I'm going to share at least one video on all these resources, and that will be very beneficial for you. So please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, give a like, give your feedback, and don't forget to subscribe and share the video with your friends. And thank you so much for watching the entire video. Until I meet you in our next video, it's bye bye from Vasan Shanmugam and your favorite Little Sla YouTube channel. Bye bye.